Hi, so I thought I'd do a little video about the twin flame journey and the growth that seems to need to happen on both sides. Now, I'm not any kind of expert, I'm not a psychologist, but this is just my observations of the thing. And it strikes me that divine timing is at play throughout. And I don't necessarily mean divine timing to get you back together with this person. I mean divine timing for your healing in really profound ways that just wouldn't have happened without this journey. So basically, a twin flame activation can happen many years after a first initial meeting. It can be a case of knowing somebody on a spiritual level, whereas before maybe you were just highly attracted to them, fell in love very quickly, all of this. When they come back in at a later date, now suddenly it's unlocking past life realizations, or it's unlocking intense spiritual feelings that can't be rationally explained. And so you're dealing with all manner of emotions and on several different levels. And so this is happening to the divine feminine, from what I gather. And the divine masculine, in this instance, we're going to say that he's an avoidant, because it seems that an awful lot of divine masculines are avoidant. So for their part then, it seems that they can sense something going on, but they don't quite know what. It falls outside of their sort of rationalistic way of looking at things. So they're benching it. They don't really want to look at it. It's outside of their ability to comfortably categorise it, and therefore potentially outside of their control. And avoidants like to stay in control. So they're benching it. They're not looking at it. They're busying themselves in work and they're going quiet. Meanwhile, the divine feminine is going through many phases. There's a sense of coming into these realizations, which can be intensely painful as well, as you realise there's this past life connection. And then you're coming into the realisation of who this person really is. So maybe when you first encountered them, you fell in love with them on a very deep level, put them on a pedestal, you didn't even realise, and now they've come back into your life and you realise that they're very emotionally stunted. They're a nice person, they'd make a good friend, but they're very emotionally stunted. And so suddenly your world collapses as this person that you'd had on a pedestal has now come off it. And that can be really painful, because you've got this realisation on the one hand that you've spent more than one lifetime with this person in all probability, and yet how they're showing up in this world is in a way that simply leaves too much room for doubt in terms of a physical relationship. The trust isn't there. They can't really be there for you in the way that you'd want them to be. They can't really be consistent in their feelings. Maybe they flirt a lot. That's classic avoidant behaviour as well. And you sense that they can't even be there for themselves. Not really. Not on a deep, authentic level. And therefore they cannot be there for anybody else truly either. As you're going through these realizations, you're realizing also your own patterns of behavior that made you so utterly in love or mesmerized by an avoidant in the first place. If you fall in love with an avoidant, it can be the most traumatic experience. It's a real trauma bond, because you're falling in love, you're releasing all of these feel-good hormones, your body is, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, etc. But as you're doing this and your bond is deepening with them, they're simultaneously pulling away from you. Because for an avoidant, emotional attachment feels deeply unsafe. And this is a wound that stems from their childhood, from one or both parents or caregivers not being consistent with their love, perhaps being very aloof or distant, and the avoidant sort of developed a set of tools to combat this, being more logical, rational, taking up less space, needing less emotion from their parents. And so over the years, they became accustomed to this. They lived in their heads. They became very logical, very aloof, maybe quite witty, and able to have quite a funny running commentary about the world, perhaps, but nothing from here, nothing from the heart. And that's their shell, that's their persona that they've developed, this sort of egoic tower that they live in as a means of defence. And they don't even know anymore that that's what they've done. It's such an unconscious behaviour now. But for the divine feminine, this could just be one of a pattern that they're realising, that they've attracted all of these types of inconsistent people over the years. Maybe they've been in situationships. Maybe they've been involved with people who have low emotional quotient. Maybe they have been involved with people who are just a bit flippant, come in and out of their lives, who just don't give them what they need emotionally. And on the twin flame journey, suddenly there's no running from that. As you're learning about this and you're recognising this has been a pattern, you're able to then trace that back to your own childhood and maybe realise that you had inconsistent love as a child. Maybe you had a parent who would be a bit hot and cold, would be a bit loving one minute and then distant the next, etc. And so you found there was no consistency with regards to that love being shown to you. Now, when we get a bit older, neuroscience says that we attract relationships that reflect what we know, not necessarily what we would like, not what is healthy, but what we already know. And so if that has been your upbringing and that's kind of imprinted itself on your consciousness, as you get older then, you unconsciously seek out relationships which mirror that uncertainty, that chaos, that not knowing, that lack of foundation, that lack of decent consistency of care. And so suddenly, when you're in the twin flame dynamic, suddenly you can see that it was your childhood that led to this. And that maybe it gave you quite low self-esteem as well. That usually goes hand in hand. You were people-pleasing, etc. Maybe not even quite consciously aware that this sort of behaviour isn't good enough. And you probably found in your first time around with this person that you were yourself in quite a heightened level of anxiety. And it's not uncommon for anxious people to fall for avoidant types. However, your anxiety was probably your own intuition screaming at you that something was wrong, and maybe you overlooked it, maybe because on the outset things looked okay, or maybe they were telling you that things were okay. You learned to ignore your feelings or bury them or put them to one side and try and deal with them, try and cope with this crushing anxiety. And anxiety can present for a number of reasons. Sometimes it can be irrational, of course. But in the case of being involved with an avoidant, what can happen is the avoidant will almost love bomb at the beginning of a relationship. They'll be very loving and kind and attentive to your needs. And that'll feel amazing. And they can do that because at that time, they're not actually that emotionally invested themselves. What then happens is as they start to develop an emotional bond with you, that's when it triggers them in a very deep way. And so what they start doing is pulling away. They pull away. And so whereas you were used to a certain amount of love and care and attentiveness from this person, now you're facing emotional coldness, emotional distance, inconsistency. And they don't even really know they're doing it. They can't be honest about it. So they'll say to you everything is fine, but you've not heard from them in a week. And everything is fine, but you've only been together 3 months or 6 months, and you would still like, especially if you're having a long distance relationship, and you would still like to talk to them on a daily basis or every other day or every few days or something. And they're just not interested. And they say, oh, I'm just really busy, etc. But your feeling is telling you something isn't right, something isn't right, something isn't right. But they're telling you everything is fine. So it's like a form of inadvertent gaslighting. To them, it feels fine because they're keeping you at a distance. They're keeping their emotions at bay. But to you, you understand intrinsically that this isn't what you want, but you don't yet feel happy talking about it. You can't yet articulate that it's a problem. So you assume the problem is with you. Oh, I'm being anxious and I shouldn't be anxious. Everything is fine. But it's a story you're telling yourself. So the twin flame journey then, because it's such an intense emotional thing, it's pushing you to heal, because you get to a point where you're still talking to this person, but even talking to them just a little bit can feel emotionally draining, even if you're just saying hello, because your feelings for them are so great. And so if they're breadcrumbing you, or if they're being inconsistent, and if you know that it's kind of futile that you're talking to them, you can get to a point where you just have to stop and you pull that energy back to yourself. And it's kind of doing it as a survival mechanism. It's not to be cruel. It's not to be unkind. You're not playing games with them. You're not trying to teach them a lesson. It's literally a case of, if you value your own emotional well-being, you have to. And maybe even physical well-being as well, because the twin flame journey, the emotions are so vast, so difficult to navigate. It can make you physically ill in some instances as well. So in order that you protect yourself, look after yourself, you have to just stop that communication with them a while. Pour that energy back into you. Look after yourself. Cherish yourself. Cherish your long-held dreams and projects. What are you doing? Are you doing what you want to do? And so on. And in so doing, you're simultaneously doing 2 or 3 things at once. You're pouring that energy back into you. You're regaining your level of self-worth. You're flooded with insight because you're recognizing these childhood patterns and where they came from. You're recognizing that you're worthy of so much more love than you've allowed yourself to have over the years, because you've been falling for these inconsistent people. And you're recognizing your self-worth to such a degree that you're taking up more space. You're putting yourself out there. You're cherishing yourself, your projects, your dearly held dreams, and you're giving them your attention and worth and sense of worthiness, whereas before maybe you'd have benched all that to people please for other people, and you wouldn't have even known that that's what you're doing necessarily. But if you don't value yourself too highly, you don't value your gifts, your the things that you're naturally good at. You don't value the things that you put out into the world either. It all goes hand in hand. So if you start valuing yourself, you start realizing what you have to offer. You start nourishing that and cherishing that. And I'm not talking about being narcissistic or anything like that. I'm just talking about value, understanding your value without apology, without diminishing yourself. Because one thing that people do when they lack self-worth, when they lack confidence, they're always apologising for themselves. They always imagine everyone around them is more worthy. They don't take up very much space. They're always saying, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I don't need to do this. No, I'll bench this in my own life and look after your needs instead. When you start to develop that level of self-worth, now you're saying, hang on a minute, I'm just going to attend to this in my own life, and then I'll see to you whatever you need help with, etc. tomorrow. You start putting your needs first. You start putting yourself first. You start recognizing that you're as worthy as other people, and that's a really big deal. So you start healing. You're recognizing patterns, and you're learning that you're really worthy. And maybe for the first time, maybe you've had people put you down in your life, and maybe you've been out with all the wrong people. Maybe your partners have always been a bit inconsistent, etc. Maybe you've been making excuses for that, and maybe you didn't even know to want something else, I saw a comment only today on social media where somebody said they were with an avoidant partner, and they said they waited for 6 years, and they said now we've been together for around 20 odd years, and that it was worth it. And sometimes anxiety and worry rears its ugly head, but it was worth it because of love. And I feel like that's a potential worrying statement. That isn't necessarily a triumph of love. It might be. Maybe they talk about it. Maybe he reassures her. Maybe he's doing some work on himself if he's avoidant. More than likely, she's learned to bury her own needs. She's learned to bury her feelings of worry and anxiety, and decide that her love for him is more important than those feelings. That because she loves him, those feelings don't matter. And that's a complete lie. Love is both an emotion that we feel, and it's something that we do. And if you're just feeling love but getting nothing back from your partner, even if they tell you they love you, there have to be actions to match that. And I feel like we sort of sell ourselves short for a reason as women, In the olden days, as a woman, you grow up with this romantic notion of love. You grow up with the idea that a man will come into your life, sweep you off your feet, be very romantic and very loving. You fall in love, and then it's happily ever after, and then everything is good, And as you get older, that starts to erode. The fantasy starts to give way a bit to the reality. But there's still that sense of women needing rescuing. There's still that sense of men as the rescuer archetype. And there's still that sense that women must be seen and not heard. We're brought up to be good and nice as women. You're good and you're nice. You're not awkward and difficult. You're good and you're nice. And that's a goal of women. And it can be a terribly toxic thing. It's nice to be nice. It's nice to be helpful and kind. Of course it is. But being nice to the point of sacrificing your own needs, your own voice, your own life in any way is a danger. And sometimes life calls for us to be a little less nice. Sometimes life calls for us to be a little bit wilder, a little bit harsher, maybe a little bit firmer, and not quite so agreeable, And we want to be agreeable, especially if you're neurodivergent in any way. Sometimes oversharing is because people want to find that connection with another, and they think that they need to do the legwork. They need to be the ones. Typically, people who overshare are chronic people pleasers. They think they need to be the ones to fix the other person. If there's abject silence in your partner and you're there blurting things out in the hope to crack a smile from them, in the hope to get something, anything, but that isn't your place to try to fix them, but as women, we are brought up to be this ameliorating party. We're brought up to be this person that fixes, that softens, that does all the legwork, that helps heal other people, and so on. So when you get to a certain age, there's a bit of unlearning, I think. If we've got into habits of being too nice, too giving at times, to feel like we must be the ones to fill an awkward silence, to try to hold space for another who doesn't really want to participate. Sometimes it's good to just pause and ask yourself the question, is this my work to do? Is this my work to do? And I feel like the twin flame journey for a woman asks us to investigate ourselves on a very deep level and do a lot of deep work that's very, very beautiful. Don't get me wrong, it can be hell at times because you're going through so much emotion with this recognition of who this person may or may not have been in other lives, etc. But because of that, perhaps it's getting you to do deep work that maybe would have gone unnoticed or left. You know, sometimes we can just try and paper over the cracks in our lives, in our psyches, and just carry on, you know, and we don't know. We don't know just how unhealed we are, what we're carrying, our version of ourselves that we need to let go of now as we're getting older. Maybe that served a purpose for a while. Maybe that in its own way is a survival mechanism, this people-pleasing aspect of you. You don't have to become the complete opposite of that either. But being able to know your worth without apology means not always having to scoop up the other person, not always having to dive in with the overshare, not always having to meet them where they're at, but maybe stay where you are and see if we can meet in the middle, perhaps with a bit of equal give and take, you know. So I feel like this work could have been done in no other way. And I feel like for the divine masculine too, there is this wild, deep invitation into the very core of who they are. And it's the very thing they've been managing to avoid all their lives. And of course, if they're an avoidant, that's who they are on a very authentic, heart-centered level. The emotion that they didn't want to look at, that scared them, that gave them anxiety perhaps, that they ran away from and benched because it felt too awkward, too difficult. They didn't want to look at it. They wanted to flirt with other people to soften the sense of connection and obligation to any one human. And suddenly the twin flame journey, again, so deep, so wild, so something so difficult to what they're used to what they can explain in an easy way, that here they are, forced perhaps to look at themselves in quite a deep way. They recognise now the patterns within them that are unhealthy. Maybe they have to deal with a deep core wound of shame. Because the avoidant is given so little love in a consistent manner during childhood, they carry an unconscious wound of shame, not a conscious thing. And they feel like if they were to get together with their partner, if their partner were to know them on a very deep level, it feels wildly uncomfortable. And they feel like they would be broken up with, because if only they knew the real them on the inside, they wouldn't stay. So they keep everyone at arm's length. And this too could be a bit of an unconscious thing going on for them. But again, the wildness, the depth, the craziness of a twin flame connection might be the only thing that gets them to really wake up to who they are. And some avoidants might be able to heal and get the help they need. And maybe some might not, because when you build a set of tools, inside your psyche that keep the world at emotional distance on that level, for that prolonged level of time, you're asking somebody to dismantle their entire persona that's kept them safe in the world. And A, that isn't going to happen overnight, and B, it might be too much for some people to do. And so it's got to be something that comes from them. They have to want to change. They have to, first of all, see the mechanisms in place. Their own egoic mind is probably preventing them from even seeing these mechanisms in place. You know, the ego is very good at keeping us safe, just not always in the healthiest way possible. So firstly, they've got to be able to look at themselves. Secondly, they've got to be able to acknowledge it. And they've got to be able to do so in a way where they can differentiate any shame they feel, any guilt they feel. It isn't necessarily to say they are a terrible human. It is to say that maybe they've handled things badly in the past, and that's okay. We're all human. We can all handle things badly. But to be able to differentiate how they acted from who they are on a core level, you know, because they will probably think, oh, I'm a terrible person. Oh, I can't do this properly. I must therefore be a terrible person. And they need to be able to tease that apart and say, I might not have acted very well in the past, and I can feel some level of perhaps guilt or shame, and then allow those things to act as a catalyst for change, allow those things to push me into learning something different. But to not get eaten up by those emotions either, because we're all human, we all make mistakes. To be able to forgive yourself is huge and really, really important. Having compassion for yourself is important. And then being able to differentiate that from who you are at a core level, to understand that you are still worthy, you're still lovable, you're still very, very, very worthy on this planet, you know? So that's a bit of work perhaps for the avoidant person to do. Do they even need to hold that much shame? Have they blown it out of proportion? And so on. You know, for whatever they may have done in the past, how much they may have ghosted a partner or things like this, because avoidants do tend to ghost people and so on. So there's work there for both parties, and I would argue the only way that in some cases we change is through great rifts. You know, this is like tectonic plates shifting under our feet. The weight, the heaviness, the difficulties arising from a twin flame connection can be so great that it pushes us to do the things that are very difficult or very deep that we simply wouldn't do otherwise. We might not see these patterns of behaviour, recognise them, or understand them in such a deep way. And I believe in some instances then that that's what the twin flame journey is here to do. It's here to help us discover more of who we are. And Plato said, know thyself. Many people have said this. It's the foundation for who we are on this planet, to know ourselves, to know who we've been, what we've been, the way that we have chosen to react in certain circumstances and to act. And then with that knowledge, we now have a little bit of insight that might help propel us forward into a different way of being in our lives. Not necessarily together with this twin flame, but in your own life in a way that's so authentic and deep and real, with so much love and care for yourself, both for the divine feminine and for the divine masculine. Both with that respect, that love, that care that maybe is for the first time happening, maybe, that you cannot help but invite in a better future for yourselves, because as within, so without. What starts within has to have a ripple effect outward in the world, but it has to start within, and that's the only way. And so I would say that the twin flame journey then is a very, very powerful invitation into the core of who you are. And if you can make it, that's great. And if you can't, no shame, no shame. It's a hard, wild, difficult journey. But if you can make it, then the riches of discovering your hidden depths, what's within you, and that you are so much more lovable than you ever thought possible, well, then that's golden. It's beautiful, and it's well worth coming out the other side. Take care. God bless, and I wish you well.